My name's Helen Drake and I'm the current chair of UACES. And I'm here with Jo Shaw, former UACES chair, and I'm here with Richard Whitman, also former UACES chair, my predecessors in other words. And hello Richard, hello Jo. I'd like to ask a few questions about your time as UACES chair. So maybe the first question is just to test your memory and ask you to tell us when you were chair, and to tell us what it was like for you being chair. For example, how did you go about setting your agenda and your strategy? UACES has a constitution. Did that give you ideas, or did you devise your agenda and your strategy sort of from other sources? So I don't mind who goes first. Maybe Jo, do you want to go first?
Well, I'm the older vintage, so maybe yes. Although I think when I joined the committee in 2000, I think Richard might have been on the committee at that point. Yeah. Then he left the committee and then came back again as chair later on. I was on the committee from 2000 to 2003, and then I was chair from 2003 to 2006. So it's quite some time ago, so you'll appreciate that the memories are not necessarily that fresh. But nonetheless, it was a great experience to be chair. That time, I think, was a crucial period of time when UACES was really building up its engagement with the Student Forum, and also was developing its internationalisation. I think those were two things that Clive Archer had already started, and I was very pleased to carry on building those. So I'm not sure I innovated in terms of strategy and approach, but I perhaps pushed a number of things in that domain, which Clive had already started developing. Well, one thing in relation to internationalisation was that you talked about the Constitution. We changed the Constitution so that institutionalised having a member of the committee who was part of the group of members, the growing group of members, now very significant group of members who are not based in the UK. Of course, the UK-based group is very international because of the still strong internationalisation of British universities. But very large numbers of people were now active in UACES who were based outside the UK. And it seemed to me to be important to ensure that they had some voice on the committee so that they felt that it was more and more a European association and not just somehow a UK association that had some type of sort of irredentist ambitions almost vis-a-vis the other European EXAs, European Community Studies Associations, that are organised under the frame of the sort of Commission-sponsored World EXA. So those were some of the things that really inspired me in terms of my work. I'll pass to Richard now.
Thank you.
Well, in between the two of us, there was another chair, which was Alex Worley-Lack. So I came in from 2009 to 2012. And I think it's interesting to sort of look across that period because I think by the late 2000s we had already established, it was a sort of well-established idea that the conference sort of went overseas without it being something was exceptional. Because you may remember when you were chair, it was Zagreb.
Zagreb,
We had the Zagreb conference.
That was the first?
No, Budapest.
Budapest.
Yeah, there was an anniversary conference in Budapest, but that was seen to be exceptional, I think. And then I think from Zagreb onwards, I think really the idea was established that essentially because of the membership, it was, a sort of internationally focused association, and therefore the idea should be that going overseas wasn't exceptional. It was sort of part of the bread and butter of the way that the association functioned, and the fact that the conference really was for most people the sort of centrepiece of their engagement with UACES. And so we also had by that time sort of established the idea that there was a sort of a very active competition actually to host the annual conference, whereas I think in the past it's the idea had been really that it was sort of UK universities. I think one of the things that was very well established by the early 2000s was that we had overseas institutions that were willing, able and even to tussle between themselves to sort of host the conference, which I think was reflective, as Jo said, of the sort of changing composition of the membership, where we were sort of the 50% mark in terms of the number of members who were non-UK based, I think, and then non-UK nationals. But it was even larger actually in terms of the sort of composition of the membership. I think the other thing that we did establish by the late 2000s was what you might call something that had always been there in the history of UACES, which was practitioner engagement. But I think it developed in a more structured way, in the sense that we started to have events in Brussels which were intended to sort of sell European studies research back into Brussels, which was I think it was an innovation under Alex, and we had that established by that time. And of course, the sort of stable of UACES publications was also developed because JCER came into existence as well, alongside JCMS, and the book series also transferred from Sheffield University Press to Routledge.
Yeah.
If I could just interject, perhaps on the internationalisation, along with Emily Linneman, our executive director, we've been back to the early minutes, back to the late 60s when UACES began its life, and there were interesting discussions. We've seen them from the papers, not just the minutes. First of all, about whether students should even be members. So it was not a student membership association at that point. So it's interesting that you talked about the student forum when you set up, because that is now a very important aspect of UACES, and that you both developed that. But also internationalisation. Looking back to those early papers, there were discussion, and in fact, in the first ever mission statement, the wording was along the lines of UACES, or in its early incarnation, would have relations with continental universities, and then some of the very first committee meetings talked about what those relations would look like, and there was quite a strong opinion that other countries should have their own associations. And it strikes me as current chair that one of the big developments has been the way that UACES is now the biggest European Studies Association in the world, not just in Europe, and it's
bigger than UACES now.
It's bigger than UACES now, bigger than the European Union Studies Association, which is the USA equivalent. So so your efforts in these respects have been part and parcel, I think, of quite significant changes to the association and its remit.
I think that one of the things that UACES has evolved over time has been the conference. When I first attended some UACES events, and I think Richard's a predecessor to me than that, because as an academic lawyer, I was maybe slightly more not quite so central to some of the disciplines at a certain point, although there had always been lawyers involved in UACES. But when I started to go to a few events, then the annual conference was in January, and that seemed like a very dark time of the year to have it. And then somebody came up with the idea of having a research conference as well, which was the September one. Yeah. And that was very, very, very lively. And I think that coincided with the period of time when Drew Scott and Simon Bulmer were JCMS editors, and they infused a lot of academic engagement and credibility, and really took JCMS on from strength to strength. And that, I think, fed back into the idea of having a research conference. People came up with various opportunities to sort of build that up, special events, anniversaries, one thing and another, as the years went by. And by the time I took on being chair and joined the committee, then the September conference was established as the event. But although it's grown over the years, it still retains a certain sort of size and focus that the large international conferences don't have. So you actually do think that there's some real academic work going on within the framework of the conference. It isn't just about networking.
No,
it isn't just about you've got to be there because it's a hiring venue and that type of thing. It has a genuine academic exchange dimension to it, and I was delighted to see that you were playing around with different types of sessions this year, the different types of questions about what academics do and should be doing in European studies. So each chair brings their own dynamic.
Yeah. I think I'd agree with Joe that the game changer was having the research conference, because, prior to 1995, which was the first research conference, I mean, the winter conference, as it was essentially a sort of gathering of academics and practitioners, and I think a lot of people thought it was a way of sort of topping up your lecture notes in terms of seeing what practitioners were saying about particular policy areas. But from 95 onwards, of course, what it also did then was to create the capacity for people to be involved in the conference, conference as participants by delivering papers rather than just being sort of consumers of plenary type sessions. And in turn, I think that fed the internationalisation, because there was in a conference opportunity that people could make paper proposals to and attend and so on. I think originally it was every other year. I think maybe the first instance. I know the first one was Birmingham, and I think the second was Loughborough, the second conference. But for a while, you're right, the two things ran in parallel, didn't they?
I mean, you're right, going through the papers again. The January one was always a one-day event, and it was sort of it was invitation only, as in the speakers were by invitation only, and it was not the great and the good, but sort of prominent members of the profession plus practitioners. And so the research conference, that was supposed to be something very different, and now they've merged. But I like to think we've kept the best of both. In that we still do have the plenaries and with invited speakers, so that people can top up the lecture notes, as you say, while also participating.
I mean, one of the things I know was an anxiety, and I don't know whether that still holds, is the sort of blend within the individual panels themselves between more experienced academics and PhD students, because I know it's something that we sort of agonised over in the past, to make sure that it was useful, particularly for PhD students, to have panels which were provided that function. But I think also now that you've got the student forum, you've got that learning venue which is separate, but obviously still connected to the main conference, haven't you?
Okay.
I mean, the things grow in parallel. But in terms of the development of ensuring that early career researchers get a good deal out of UACES. Again, this year you've introduced a sort of early career membership.
That's right, a new tier.
A new tier of membership between the PhD students and, as it were, the full members, which I think is important. It was one of these things of, didn't we do that before? But clearly not.
It seems so natural. And I think, sorry if I could just add, I mean, one of the things is that the early career tier, those members are full members in their own right, in the way that student members are full members in their own right, as well as the more mature members, shall we say. So there's not a junior membership, it's just recognising that they're at a different point in their career and sort of and so on. So I'm glad that that's been noticed and it seems a good thing.
I think that what's important about UACES is the way in which sort of understanding career development is organic to the organisation. It's to the institution. It's part of the DNA of the institution. It's not a professional association that exists and then you have to be a member of it because you would be sort of casting yourself out from your academic discipline. It's something different to that because it's between some of the different traditional disciplines. European studies has had to work hard to maintain its raison d'etre, to secure a future not just in the UK but in other parts of academia in Europe and North America and so on, where it's come under threat for what is it?
I mean, that does move us into perhaps the second broad question. It moves nicely in, which is the meaning, how the meaning of UACES, both for yourselves as academics and then for your careers more generally. But yes, with regards to what some would not even call a discipline, European studies. So I'd be really interested in your reflections on that sort of the significance of UACES, especially 50 years on, in those respects. So,
I've always been an interdisciplinary scholar. My training's in law, but I think one of the funniest things that was ever said to me at a UACES conference was, "You're some sort of lawyer, aren't you?" By which I think that was meant as a compliment, but it's hard to tell. But it's I like to think that I've, been able to work with both political scientists and legal scholars and bring some of the questions that they ask into debate with each other and be, genuinely interdisciplinary rather than just pluri or multidisciplinary. And that's where UACES can offer that opportunity to both to be within your disciplines, but also to play with the lines that are between them. And as a lawyer, as chair of the association, I certainly felt very comfortable. I always thought about UACES conference as being one where I felt like I could be in my slippers. I was very comfortable there. And
it's a nice image.
Yeah, and it wasn't somewhere where you felt that you had to be, somehow on your best behaviour and so on. So I think that UACES conference has existed in a way, in a good synergy with this interdisciplinary field of European studies. That's what I like to think, in the sense that it's continued to develop and grow as a conference.
Yeah.
Despite the challenges that the field has faced in the UK with the REF, the RAE, and other things. But then, of course, we predated the impact agenda by working very actively with practitioners in a way that perhaps has now ought to be bearing fruit, but who knows?
I've always thought about UACES more as a sort of clan, in the sense that that people have quite a lot of loyalty to the association, but it's not on the basis of the same kind of affiliation that you get with a discipline. In the sense that there's an acceptance of difference and different interests, but at the same time, what brings people together is obviously they're interested in European integration, broadly understood, even if they're coming from quite different disciplinary backgrounds. And I think also the other thing that's been noticeable about the subject area is they haven't really suffered from sort of theological disputes, and I think that also gives the conference a bit of a different feel, because it's not as if the case that people sort of herd to particular panels because they have a sort of particular perspective, or they work within a particular school, which means they wouldn't necessarily go to another panel. So there's more of an opportunity to graze, I think, in terms of different areas. But I think one of the developments that sort of kept that, but also helped things to allow for a bit more sort of congealing in some areas, is the collaborative research networks, and having things where there are a group of people perhaps who have met through conferences, who have identified a shared research agenda, have then been able to sort of make a bid to be able to do things either within the conference but also outside the conference in terms of sort of pushing on an area of research. And I think that's been a far more successful model than the one that other associations have had, where you have sections, for example, or whether you have groups which are much sort of permanent standing structures, which can sometimes become quite atrophied because it's the same old people who are sort of doing those or working within them, whereas the CRNs are designed in a way to sort of have a fixed term duration to do some things, and there may be a follow-on CRN, but otherwise they will die a sort of natural death, and then you get a new set of ideas come forward. And I think that combination has worked quite well, actually, sort of having the general conference, if you like, the general panels, but also having the CRN sort of infusing the conference panels, but as I say, also doing things outside. And they've also, I think, driven quite a lot of research that probably otherwise wouldn't have been there, because the sort of threshold for creating one is much lower than, for example, a very large research project, an H2020 type project, where you'd require much more legwork and obviously much more paperwork to put something into existence.
It's very. I mean, if I could just sort of, in response to your insights there, perhaps in particular to do what you said about the research networks and so on. Perhaps we are trying to publicise that sort of thing more in a time period now when we feel, or we detect that especially younger scholars' careers are far more tightly perhaps circumscribed by institutional constraints and funding constraints and so on, to the extent that we've noticed even a sort of a fall off in demand for things that we're giving, in terms of sort of funding for PhD fieldwork, funding for these sorts of research networks. So it's good to hear that they do still represent an intrinsic value, and that we can continue to encourage our younger scholars to take them up. But maybe to sort of close on this subject without wishing to be negative, is it not the case that the academic career, particularly in the UK, so UACES is concerned with that, but not only, perhaps does it squeeze scholars more, do you think? And in so doing, push them towards the big beast, whether it's the big funding councils and research councils and so on, or is there still a role for us, for our sort of offering, which is not, it's not a big research council and so on and so forth.
Well, you would have hoped so. There's always whenever I come to UACES conference, and unfortunately that's not every year, there are always a sort of a new sort of early career cadre of legal scholars who are coming along for the first or second time, who haven't been along before, and there's maybe still more space to develop that interest and that engagement, and perhaps also take on some of those leadership type roles. Maybe leadership's the wrong word, but leadership at the appropriate level, if you will, to launch a new network or whatever. Is there's still enough space in the legal academic career to develop that it wouldn't be so constrained. I can't really speak for how how political science has become more regimented. I have a sense that that's the case.
You mentioned the REF, which
I have a sense that that's impacted quite heavily in other disciplines, but I'm not perhaps the best to comment on that.
I think one of the periods in which perhaps there might have been the most heightened anxiety about European studies was the disappearance of European studies as an REE panel. Because certainly for UK-based scholars, that's in terms of the way that research is measured, that kind of plugging into that unit of assessment. And when that disappeared, I think it was potentially a moment of great vulnerability in terms of European studies within the UK. But I think it's interesting that UACES and European studies, certainly in the UK, has weathered that storm. It's also weathered the problems associated with the decline of language teaching, which European studies was very much a part of. And you've ended up with, conferences which are still of the same scale as was the case previously. But I think one of the things that's absolutely consolidated now, and I think this is a great thing, is that the non-UK nationals are the sort of defining feature of the conference. The balance has shifted clearly across time, and I think that's great news for UACES. I think it's also very, very good news for scholars of European studies in the UK, in the sense that you've already got a kind of network that you can plug into very, very easily, and at pretty low cost as well. I mean, that's perhaps one of the other things that we don't give UACES enough credit for, is the costs of access are quite low. I think not just the financial cost, but also I think the cost of just sort of getting in there in terms of being part of a panel and so on. And some other professional associations have different mechanisms by which they choose conference papers, the access points for people in terms of sections or parts of the conference and so on. So I think the sort of gateway or the sort of gatekeeping aspect of participation in the conference is set quite low in a positive way that allows people to come and sort of try and then potentially come back again, which is not always the case from other associations.
We've got enough time left to broach a third and final issue, which is, let's call it Brexit. That's the easiest way to describe the current situation, whereby the UK it has embarked on a process to withdraw from the European Union. Now, you both know, as previous chairs, that UACES began its life before the UK joined what was then the community, and in fact the failure to join in the 60s on 2 occasions, as far as I can work out from looking at the papers, was a spur to the creation of what has now become UACES, as in a worried group of academics in the UK wanted to set up a group to learn about what was happening on the continent, and then, as you know, within quite a short space of time, to study the accession process and their membership. So 50 years on, as you know, sort of one of the things that I've spent time on as chair in this year, 2017. It's 50 years since 1967, and here we are 50 years on, with the UK negotiating to leave. So I suppose my hope, my expectation is that UACES will outlive the UK's formal membership or current membership of the EU. There's even more to understand. We go back perhaps to being the worried academics who feel we need a forum to understand what's going on and to understand what will become the EU 27. So that's how I would pitch this. But of course, it would be great to hear from both of you, whether it's advice or guidance for my successor, who in a year's time will be whoever they may be, will be taking up the chair. You know, how do you see the association's future? You may not gaze into the next 50 years, but how do you see the association's future in, let's call it a Brexit / post-Brexit environment? Any thoughts? Your insights welcome.
I'm not sure I can say very much about how I would predict the association might go forward, but I would like to say something about the role of law and legal scholars in that, because I think there's a parallelism between the two phases, not just in the way that you described it, but also in terms of how then at those 2 phases suddenly everybody becomes a European Union lawyer, or as we would now say, a European Union lawyer. So in the same way that legal scholars were quite prominent in the early years of UACES, that perhaps in the middle years was not so obvious, in the same way that sort of epistemic communities of lawyers in different parts of professional and academic practice are clearly, as people like Morten Rasmussen have shown, are very clearly very much part of the sort of engine of integration that got moving in the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s. So in this field, suddenly people are tweeting out little gifs of Michael Dugan telling the one of the House of Commons committees exactly what a non-tariff barrier to trade is. And I tried asking Leave campaigners what they were going to do about non-tariff barriers to trade during the referendum campaign, and I think, no, don't be silly. I mean, it's all about tariffs. And of course, it's not about tariffs. No. I've been trying to teach about non-tariff barriers to trade for 30 years, and nobody's ever been much interested. But now, of course, they are interested, and we're all now European Union lawyers. We're all experts on Article 50. We're all experts on this, that, and the other. In a way that's always been there, in an underlying way. There have always been those key lawyer, political scientist collaborations that are crucial to the development of the discipline. I'm thinking about Simon Bulmer and Kenneth Armstrong on the single market, for example, back in the 1980s. There is that sort of parallelism. So the one positive that you can take out of it in terms of interdisciplinarity is it really proves that you need people working together across the disciplines in a way that I think the ESRC programme on Brexit has taken quite a while to really get to grips, to understand, just how crucial competence issues are, or voting issues, as well as regulatory questions about, what do we understand by mutual recognition, or what is the difference between the Norway option, the Canada option, the Ukraine option, and so on and so forth. Okay. So, the centrality of legal scholarship to that process and legal understandings, I think, is at least something positive we can take out of it. And UACES has to be part of that answer because of its capacity to bring those discourses into conversation with each other.
Thank you. Yeah.
I mean, maybe to draw a contrast between, where things were in the late 60s and where they are now. I mean, it was a smaller group of people studying the EU, but also quite people from quite different but connected networks.
Yeah.
That you had other organisations like Chatham House, for example, where you had the same people. John Pinder, who was the recipient of the first UACES Lifetime Achievement Award. These were people who were, a group of people who were all quite active in seeking to understand, to explain, but also to make the argument for UK EU accession. I think where we are now is clearly we've got more professionals who would suggest that they are studying the EU. We've got a far more diffuse field, and actually one of the challenges is how you bring people together who are operating in their own individual silos in a way that sort of make connections that are useful at this particular moment in time. So I think that's something that's worth thinking about, because one of the big changes across time, and you see this very clearly in the literature, is that there were a lot of EU generalists, and now we've got a lot of EU individual area or sub-area specialists.
Yes.
And how you're able to marry those two things together, which I think is a real challenge. But I think also perhaps there is a sort of issue of morale, esprit, in terms of at the start of the association there was clearly a project and a direction of travel which was the idea that the UK should be part of European integration process, whereas now there is that uncertainty, isn't there, as to what the destination might look like for the UK. And so thinking further down the road, is it the case that one of the core focuses is going to be, the UK exceptionalism, or is it going to be the case that we have a sort of recurrence of the older debates, which is, what's the re-entry trajectory, or, where is the UK in terms of being semi-detached and so on, and that throws up all sorts of different issues, particularly for the study of the EU in the UK, but also how you then become a sort of blended association in a way with perhaps a lump of people who are sort of on the outside or thinking about, how you connect in a different kind of way, whereas the majority perhaps are preoccupied with how the show continues to operate.
Exactly, because that's the difference. So coming back to what we were talking about earlier on, in terms of the sort of a lot of the energy of the association coming from people for whom Brexit, everyone's saying, well, Schulz and Merkel didn't spend most of their debate talking about Brexit. Well, of course not. And it's the same, I'm sure, with many of the panels in the conference are quite rightly getting on with understanding, new modes of governance, new different types of economic or geopolitical security threats and so on, understanding Russia. So maybe we can not make the mistake of going in with British exceptionalism. Were we to go round the circle again, maybe we can help to try to overcome that. I'm sceptical as to whether that's possible, in the sense that in wider society, British exceptionalism is incredibly healthy and continuing, and sadly, a lot of people have just got very thick sacking on their head and just can't really understand it. But maybe academics can play a role in trying to do that. And the fact that UACES has got this substantial group who are business as usual. There's a lot of questions that aren't just Brexit.
And on that note, I think that is a good note. I think that is a good place to end. That it's not all about Brexit. Joe, Richard, thank you very, very much. My time as chair has been made all the easier and more enjoyable by the foundations that you put in place, but also by the fact that you're still part of the group. A clan sounds like others are excluded. It's not, but that you're still here. You still come to the conferences, and that means an awful lot. And I think, so thank you both very much for doing the interview today. Much appreciated.
Thank you.